Hello, my name's Ben Wheadon. I'm a postgraduate student at Lincoln College, currently finalising my master's degree in English and American Studies, and as the recipient of this year's Kenneth Sewards-Shaw Scholarship Award, I've been invited by the college to present a short original paper today. This paper is based on my undergraduate dissertation submitted to King's College London in 2020, and it considers how early punk rock music approached the topic of gender through its lyricism. This is a condensed version of that paper, so a few texts, songs, artists have had to be omitted for the sake of brevity, but it should still provide a good overview for early punk rock's interaction with gender. I would like to give a brief content warning before starting, however, as this is a paper centred around discussions of gender and sexuality. Consequently, at times the lyrics discussed could be distressing to some. This paper contains lyrical references to sex, sexual violence, domestic abuse, stillbirth, abortion, and it will on occasions reference profanity as well. The title of my paper is "Grow Some Balls," he said, revisiting the gender politics of early punk rock after Idols' Joy as an Act of Resistance. So, with Joy as an Act of Resistance, the near universal acclaim that Idols' 2018 album enjoyed was largely unified by its combination of two characteristics. Firstly, for its excellently abrasive post-punk sound, but secondly for its relentless determination to be loudly left-wing. It was an album of clear political intentions, bouncing between ideological reticules in order to celebrate British multiculturalism, to dissect white nationalism, and to lyricise fights that, to quote the album's first song, put homophobes in coffins. It championed ideals of anti-fascism, anti-racism, anti-classism, but what served as the foundation of the album's sort of progressivism throughout could be found in its synthesis of a post-punk timbre with sensitive deconstructions of gender performativity. Now, greatly in agreement with, though admittedly probably not that aware of, Judith Butler's designation of gender as culturally constructed, with a presumption of a binary gender system, the songwriting of Idols' frontman Joe Talbot constantly alters between fierce machismo and introspective vulnerability, refusing a societally imposed sense of what masculinity is. To reference the work of Deborah Cameron as well, Talbot's proud fragility and feminist allyship rejects the false dichotomy of masculine and feminine, the tendency to classify anything and everything in terms of oppositions. Now, Talbot might not have read any Judith Butler or any Deborah Cameron, but he knows a false dichotomy when he sees one, and on Joy's seventh track, Samaritans, this was clear to see. Refusing to adhere to the societal expectations that a man should deny expressing his own emotionality, as Talbot mockingly recounted being told to grow some balls, Samaritans proved emblematic of a post-punk album with a desire to dismantle regressive notions of maleness. Now, as Idols became increasingly remarked upon for this synthesis of punk and sensitive masculinity, to quote The Independent, the sound and the intentions of Idols' album were almost presented at odds with each other, or suggestive of a contradiction. I argue then that in the celebration of this album as what many declared a novel approach to punk songwriting with gender, two possibilities emerge. Either the lyricism of punk at its mid-70s genesis now stands underappreciated for its own interactions with gender politics, or it was silently permissive or perhaps even directly contributed to regressive notions of gender at the time. This paper aims to reconsider the position of punk as a genre of rebelliousness and intends to investigate how punk engagements with gender either predate Idols' own progressivism or were themselves guilty of upholding the very problems that Joy as an Act of Resistance sought to address. Now, of course, punk didn't arrive on a specific day or with a specific album. Instead, it slowly accumulated an identity for itself over a span of several years. But prior to the accepted arrival of the genre around 1975-1976, it is important to look at the genre's most immediate predecessors in order to establish an overarching understanding of gender discourse within it. Typically dominated by the objectification of the female body, these proto-punk bands, as we might now describe them as, were not particularly progressive in their interactions with gender or sexuality. In many cases, exhibited heavy overtones of even sexual infantilization in the lyrics of bands like The Sonics, MC5 and The Stooges. Simultaneously, however, the Stooges frontman Iggy Pop can certainly be understood as a figure where punk experimentation with gender transgression find its sort of earliest predecessor. Pop famously performed with an intention to shock his audience, but also with a true commitment of fulfilling his own self-identity. To quote Amanda Petrusic's fantastic article, The Survival of Iggy Pop, a concert by the Stooges often included bloodshed, barfing, taking his clothes off, but beyond sheer public indecency, Pop's performativity had another crucial aspect, to which former bandmate Ray Manzarek of The Doors famously recounted. We go to the police station, and out comes this weaving, waving, staggering James Iggy Pop Osterberg, wearing a dress at the Hollywood station. A full-length dress. I looked at him and said, "Jim, is that a woman's dress?" And Iggy said, "No, Ray, I beg to differ. This is a man's dress." Like Iggy Pop's experimentation with presentation, the androgyny of American glam rock band New York Dolls also placed gender performance at the heart of their identity. And Patti Smith, also of this progressive New York scene, carved a position for herself at the heart of this emerging genre through a combination of androgynous presentation and the quality of her music. The establishment of Smith's sort of perceived androgyny permitted the embodiment of an active erotic perspective through her songwriting, largely restricted to male voices prior to her. With Smith grunting these audacious lyrical pelvic thrusts of masculine exertion on horses open a Gloria in excelsis Deo, Horses began with a frenzied rejection of gender expectations constructed by those preceding proto-punks. Smith deconstructed possessive masculinity and donned it for herself, creating a non-heteronormative anthem and rejecting commodified female passivity for an embodiment of lust instead. Again demonstrative of the progressive New York scene in the 1970s, and despite the relatively apolitical focus of the Velvet Underground and Nico, the VU's Lou Reed provided one of the 20th century's most prominent lyrical representations of LGBT+ identities with his 1972 single Walk on the Wild Side. Reed's deliberate pronoun usage throughout should be understood as a clear act of affirming transgender identities. Almost certainly describing the life of transgender film icon Holly Woodlawn, made famous largely by her connections to the films of Andy Warhol. The first verse's commitment to respecting Holly as a she serves as a simple yet clear message of Reed's solidarity with the transgender community. The simplicity to which Woodlawn's self-realisation that he was a she stands as perhaps demonstrative of true allyship, positioning this instance of gender identity as an acquired characteristic, not dissimilar from Simone de Beauvoir's famous notion that one is not born, but rather becomes woman. Later, the emergence of Boston's Ramones and London's The Sex Pistols from mid-1970s rock sparked a short-lived possession of true cultural dominance and the announcement of first-wave punk rock in a real sense. What is perhaps surprising, however, is that in the first wave of punk rock between 1976 and 1980, ideas of gender are almost entirely absent from an increasingly politicised expressivity of the genre's male voices. While Dick Hebdige attests that 1970s punk rock held a grim determination to bring down upon itself vehement disapproval, despite the rebelliousness of its aesthetic, music, and occasionally overt political lyrics, the wide majority of the era's groups felt no desire to explore roles of gender in their lyricism. In truth, if Ramones and the Sex Pistols stood for anything ideologically speaking, it was political apathy, with neither group offering much to dissuade suggestions of Idles' 2018 gender expression as innovative punk songwriting. Now, despite the successes of radical anti-establishment singles like Anarchy in the UK and God Save the Queen, there is very little actual political ideology to glean from the music of the Sex Pistols beyond the image of anarchy that, ideologically speaking, did prove to be quite vacant. One extreme exception to this, however, may be found in the Pistols' first record, Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, and in the song Bodies, written as an unwelcomed male perspective on the topic of abortion. The Pistols' vitriolic assault on a woman's right to choose proves a particularly regressive example of the group's songwriting, centred around imposing an unwelcomed male perspective onto a deeply painful and overwhelmingly non-male experience. Emphasising the femininity of this fictional mother Pauline through the strange repetition of female pronouns, Bodies serves not only as a disgusting interaction with the topic, but also as an opportunity for the Pistols to repeatedly attack a character who is established first as a woman and secondly as a monster, predicated entirely upon her decision not to give birth. Now, the Ramones, unlike the Sex Pistols, never stooped as low as to utilise abortion as a shock tactic. Ultimately, Ramones have little to offer either positively or negatively regarding gender in punk rock lyricism, being a band identifiably less political than their contemporaries. Compared to Ramones' apolitical stance, however, the Stranglers stood deliberately committed to an expression of sexist male perspectives. Though the band resists classification as a solely punk rock group, punk historian John Savage describes the emergence of the band in punk's commercially defined variant of new wave as a voice representative of regressive political expression. He says, the Stranglers were rightfully criticised for their puerile sexism, with songs sometimes and ugly proudly depicting actions of violent domestic abuse. But with the album Rattus Norvegicus and its single Peaches, however, the Stranglers' sexist attitudes towards women proved most obvious in the demonstration of truly toxic punk masculinity. Now, what Peaches represented most perniciously was a simultaneous awareness and a sardonic disregard for the song's overt sexism, sarcastically preaching liberation for women to the ends of providing nudity for the consumption of the song's narrative voice. It becomes a perfect encapsulation of this idea of the male gaze, which being a masculine perception of the world through a sort of scopophilic lens, identifying women as objects of unconsensual sexual function for male observers regardless of consciousness or consent. The repurposing of liberation for women demonstrated an understanding of progressive feminist causes, but perverted into a male desire to supply an exhibition of desirous forms. But male voices in punk rock were not universally silent on matters of gender or sexuality, with punk rock collective Crass proving an exception through their committed allyship with feminism. Described by feminist punk historian Lauren LeBlanc as an anarchist vegetarian collective comprised of 9 to 12 male and female musicians, Crass provided a platform for multiple political issues through their music. Again, however, they were limited when speaking about gender through a male perspective. Reflective of Beauvoir's statement that a man never begins by positing himself as an individual of a certain sex, any gender-conscious lyrics from 1979's The Feeding of the 5,000 and Stations of the Crass are found through the voices of Crass's female vocalists Yves Libertine and Joy de Vivre, and not through the voice of male vocalist Steve Ignorant. Though The Clash did a great deal to commit themselves to a consistently progressive political stance, where their determination to oppose racism was clear through their attachment to the UK's Rock Against Racism in '78, their engagement with gender politics was minimal. They remain still an obvious ancestor to Idles' machismo-led anti-conservatism, but The Clash's Joe Strummer ultimately offers a limited parallel to Idles' Joe Talbot. One all-male punk group that did, however, utilise their platform as a means of subtly challenging the position of hegemonic heteronormative masculinity were Manchester's Buzzcocks, and in particular their 1978 single Ever Fallen in Love with Someone You Shouldn't Have. As a bisexual man, Buzzcocks' songwriter Pete Shelley very rarely included gender pronouns in his songwriting, obscuring his own sexuality while producing music often removed of the active-passive sexual dichotomy that we've seen interacted with in previous songs. The core philosophy of Ever Fallen in Love demonstrated itself as flexibly twofold, being both an entirely accessible and general expression of the risks of falling in love, while also representing an expression against the social disapproval of non-heterosexuality in an era of rampant homophobia, demonstrated blatantly by the Sex Pistols' foul song New York, which was a pointedly bigoted attack on New York dolls. Though it is sexuality and not gender that sat at the heart of Shelley's subtle lyricism, what should be understood is that the presence of harmful masculinity reliably precludes non-heteronormativity, and thus Shelley's subtle representation of queer sexuality serves as a destabilisation of hegemonic maleness. The suppression of homosexuality is of course maintained in accordance with this overbearing imago of heterosexual masculinity, but whilst Shelley's songwriting sits within the incorporated masculinity of homosexual identification, the lyrical depiction of a love with somebody you shouldn't have fallen in love with is itself demonstrative of an indirect expression against gendered oppression. The covert representation of non-heteronormative romance holds dual purpose in this regard, being simultaneously a rebellion against societal expectations of sexuality, and by extension, gender too. So Buzzcocks removed Idles' designation as innovative, sensitive punks proves so far to be a fairly valid claim, I would argue. But in reality, declarations of political apathy on the topic of gender politics are only true when synonymizing punk music with male punk music. It is in the music of punk rock's female and non-male performers where Idles' gender consciousness most completely finds its 1970s precedent. Women traditionally find themselves precluded from participation in male-dominated spheres of guitar rock on the basis of imaginal technical inferiority at the time, evidenced by gender and gender alone. But with the emergence of punk rock music in particular, such technical divisions became undermined, permitting a female platform for music and for radical politics too. Anyone could pick up a guitar and scream punk rock famously, and so the barrier for entry quickly exploded, permitting greater access to those restricted before. Inequality, of course, has colossal significance to the position of gender in punk rock. Truly, the mere existence of female punk bands in these male-dominated spheres were perceived as transgressions. And while we have seen that the politics of male punk performance rarely challenged masculinity, non-male expressions of the self were necessitated to tackle that basic truth of their own gender in order to justify their place within the genre. Though the figure of Siouxsie Sioux should certainly not go ignored in any consideration of female voices in punk's first wave, the feminism of Siouxsie Sioux and the Banshees rarely found itself expressed through the group's lyrics when compared to the deliberate androgyny of her presentation. Distinctly, contemporaries, the Slits, demonstrated a much more pointed lyrical desire to reject gender conformity with songs like Typical Girls, loudly asserting gender conventions through lead singer Ari Up, intending to rupture each of these expectations in turn. The Raincoats' debut LP too dedicated itself to lyrical explorations of gender and sexuality, partially through their cover of the Kinks' Lola, but also prominently with the song Off Duty Trip, and in its depiction of a rape at the hands of a soldier on off-duty. It was delivered not as an attempt to manipulate the horrors of sexual violence as a means of Sex Pistols-esque shock, but instead represented a much deeper engagement with structural sexism and institutional violences against women. X-Ray Spex' direct interaction with gender as heard on Artificial demonstrates the group as one of Idles' closest ideological anticipants from punk rock's first wave. It is not, however, simply ideological similarities that unify Polly Styrene, the lead singer of X-Ray Spex, and Joe Talbot, but also the similarities between the two writers' approach to lyricism on the topic of gender politics. Central to this, when hearing the song Artificial mention this Jungian pretty little mask that is not me, listeners should be quick to identify the image of the mask as evocative of a similar line from Idles' Samaritans, where Talbot decried that the mask of masculinity is a mask that's wearing me. This mask of masculinity, so closely reminiscent of Artificial in both lyrical style and political intent, demonstrates Joy not as an instance of separate innovation, but rather a welcome continuation of 1970s non-male punk rock politics. The pun of mass masculinity, however, is not limited in connecting Talbot with Styrene, with an even closer resemblance to Samaritans found in the music of one of punk rock's earliest transgender figures, Jane County, but describing on song Man Enough to Be a Woman a transsexual feeling and an attention to portraying the mask of masculinity just as Idles did. Though still released while Jane was performing under the name Wayne County and as a man, though presenting as a transvestite, the direct rejection of social conformity on Man Enough to Be a Woman, expressed in an era of violent homophobia and sexism, should be understood as an expression of unabashedly punk rock rebelliousness, totally in accordance with Hebdage's description of punk as the desire to detach oneself from the taken-for-granted landscape of normalised forms. Idles' Joy as an act of resistance is then not undeserving of celebration as a determinedly gender-conscious album, which it absolutely is. But what this project serves to demonstrate instead is that the praise it received demonstrates a historical lack of representation for non-male expressions of gender in punk. To hear Joe Talbot deconstruct negative conceptions of masculinity is to hear an echo of Patti Smith, of Buzzcocks, of Jane County, and beyond. But it is also to be reminded of the collected absence of gender consciousness to which a great majority of punk's biggest names were guilty of. The appreciation of Idles and Joy is not directly indicative of a desire to undermine the few gender-conscious voices of punk rock's brief but monumental cultural significance, but it demonstrates that for critics, in the group's praiseworthy decision to challenge social conceptions of masculinity and femininity in their album, it is demonstrative as precisely that. It is recognised as a choice. For punk's women and for punk's transgender identities, however, it seems to many as entirely expected that all expression would be prefaced, I am a woman, or I am not man, overlooking their trailblazing political songwriting as the presumed lyrical focus of non-men in punk. So, thank you for listening to my talk.